for being here today for the presentation of a very timely and relevant book by our colleague Mateo Cohen. My name is Henriëtte from the Heuvel. I'm the moderator of this event, and I'd like to start with the here and now. And I suppose as we all read the papers, watch the television this weekend, I was drawn to a story of a little village called Sebastia on the West Bank. For centuries and centuries, Palestinians lived there, few Christians too, in the midst of archaeological sites. And this will end soon, because it will turn into a park, the Samaria National Park. And this will leave no room for the people who have lived there forever, and nor for their history. Also in Gaza, we see new movements now, as Israel's ongoing military response to the atrocities of Hamas. Now, earlier this month, we have a stronger new offensive with also sort of new language. It's about capturing Gaza, it's all about holding on to the territory, it's about destroying Hamas and rescue hostages, but also to move like 2.1 million people. And they say it's in order to protect them. In these events, we see what Mateo's book, Radicalized Conservatism, the One-State Ideology, and Democratic Decay addresses. Before handing the floor to Mateo, I'd like to briefly reflect on some of these themes and raise a few open questions. As all of us know, the question of how to establish peace in Israel-Palestine has been one of the most difficult and emotionally charged political challenges of our time. There were moments of hope. I think I'm one of the few old enough to have been living in these times. But that ended with the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin in 1995. In the last decades, this hope has faded, and even more so since 2023, with all the massacres that are going on. For all of us, it's difficult to witness this and to live with what we see, and also to live with the mostly silence of the world and also of here at home. Today we ask a question. The question is, how did we get here? What makes this happen? And how can we understand it? And through understanding, also find a way back to democracy and respect for human life. This book focuses on the right-wing ideology in Israel and how it became the dominant force we see today. About a week ago, as Mateo and I sat down, he made me remember before 2023 how this wave of domestic protest raised against democratic decay, and the Prime Minister, now accused of war crimes, then already had been indicted for bribery. So there's also the question, what was the need to set aside democratic principles? As I understand it, Mateo looks at ideology and how it shapes institutions and political behavior. Not just in Israel, but across Europe and beyond, we are seeing the rise of identity politics and the erosion of democratic norms. This makes Mateo's research all the more valuable. And that value is being recognized. The book has received praise across ideological lines from both critics and supporters of Israel in Europe, the US, and Israel itself. It's been called, and now I cite, an intellectual tour de force and a timely read for anyone interested in Israel politics. So it's my pleasure to welcome to the stage Mateo Cohen. He is a Leiden University lecturer and doctoral researcher, and he will present his third book and his first research monograph, Radicalized Conservatism. Please join me in welcome.
All right, thank you, Henriëtte, for your kind introduction and for contextualizing today's event. I will try to address some of the fundamental questions that you raised already before the Q&A. But before that, some words of gratitude. I would like to thank Leiden's Legitimacy and Justice Cluster and Tom Toons for co-organizing this event, to Leiden Center for Partisan Representation, to our Political Science Department, and of course to Leiden University Press for publishing my new book, Radicalized Conservatism in Israel. But before all, and above all, I would like to thank you all for coming here today and spending 1 hour of your time to two of the most difficult and unpleasant topics in today's politics, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the decline of democracy. You know, I recently came to the realization that certain academic events should start with some sort of an academic apology. Today, when I will speak about radicalized conservatism in Israel, some of the most acute developments, such as the growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza or the status of Israeli hostages, will not be mentioned beyond this title level. Of course, no academic event can ever encompass all relevant information about the subject, but with a delicate subject and an ongoing bloody war, people might get offended. So I start with this apology in the hopes that the findings of my book and the argument that I will present today will shed some light on these developments as well. My research can be categorized as a critical research, but it is mainly diagnostical. Today I will present you an executive summary with some understudied ideational contributors to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to democratic decay. I chose this diagnostical approach because I see both of these issues as entrenched in multiple misconceptions. We as a society miss key aspects of these problems, and we as a scientific community use blunt tools to analyze them, therefore limiting clarity on the matter. But I also chose this diagnostical approach out of humility, as I recognize that immense work is required simply to grasp the nature of the problem before we can suggest a comprehensive solution to the conflict or the democratic decay. So this book is an attempt to break through these misconceptions. I'm of course very interested in the normative aspects and possible responses that we can discuss in the Q&A. I will also appreciate questions and even challenges to the arguments and findings that I present today. So today I will introduce 5 misconceptions that largely correspond to the 7 chapters of my book. The first misconception can be referred to as the Zionist Consensus. So previous literature had assumed great unity within the Zionist movement, overlooking its internal ideological divisions. This, in turn, has obscured our ability to understand what is right-wing ideology in Israel. The second misconception goes to the nature of the right-wing challenge to democracy today. I argue that prominent concepts such as populism, illiberalism, and nativism actually provide just very limited analysis of the subject that they examine. And the preoccupation with this term overlooks or overshadows or even sometimes provide cover for elitist mainstream agents that challenge democracy from within the system rather than from outside the system. The third misconception is that right-wing ideas are unsophisticated, that they are irrational, that they are detached from philosophical premises. This condescending assumption has long obstructed our ability to reconstruct right-wing arguments, to get to the root of right-wing thinking, to explain its relative success, and to anticipate the next steps of right-wing movements. The fourth misconception is more to do with the Israeli case, and that's an overemphasis with religious texts and figures and actors. And I completely understand to be drawn to the most extreme and peculiar agents, and these are in Israel evidently our religious zealots, usually they're settlers. However, their ideas do not explain, and they even diverge from the ideology that has built agents like Benjamin Netanyahu and his ruling Likud party. The fifth and final misconception is the uniqueness of the Israeli case. So many assume that we cannot compare the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or processes in Israel to other countries, viewing it in isolation, even as we see growing hostility towards ethnic minorities, national minorities, sociological minorities, corresponding with a decline of democratic quality across the globe. So I will now describe these 5 misconceptions with a bit more detail. I will try to touch upon the methods that I use and the findings that contribute to the book's diagnosis. So, Zionism is the self-determination of the Jewish people and the movement to realize it in ancient Zion, which is another name for Jerusalem, situated in Israel, Palestine. But beyond that, Zionism diverges quite greatly. If we look at certain historical moments, a supermajority of Israeli Zionist parties would seem to favor territorial compromise with the Palestinians. Most recently, actually, as Henriëtte mentioned, most recently in the 1990s, until around 2010, Zionism would seem to favor land partition to end the conflict. And I actually documented 1 decade of literature that actually argued that even the Israeli right would accept an independent Palestinian state. But of course, today, this pragmatic approach to Zionism seems quite unreasonable. And indeed, if we look at other historical moments, for example, from around 10 years ago, and I would assume at least in the next 10 years, Zionism would seem to favor just one state, one Jewish state between the river and the sea. And the literature that views Zionism as a whole that way views it quite critically. It sees it as a settler colonialist enterprise infused with messianic and ethnocentric ideas. According to this critical view, Zionism is in itself an extremist right-wing ideology, and that left-wing Zionism is a complete farce. Now, we wouldn't be surprised to know that the first, more pragmatic approach is more common among self-described Zionists and their supporters, while the more critical approach is more common among Palestinians and their supporters. So I argue that both of these approaches are actually quite useful to capture just part of Zionism, but they hold the same misconception. They enforce a Zionist consensus where there is no Zionist consensus. Therefore, they misrepresent what is right-wing and left-wing ideas in Israel. So in the first chapter, I present a brief history of this left-right-wing cleavage and mark how academic debates are influenced by the changing political trends. I show that what seems like a Zionist consensus is actually usually just the dominance of one type of Zionism over another. I also show that in consistent surveys, this ideological rift has been a salient factor in determining the political identification and affiliation of Israelis. To explain this saliency of the ideological rift within Zionism, out of which I can provide a comprehensive answer to what is the Israeli right, I argue that it is ingrained in contrasting ideas about human nature, politics, and the world that actually links to a wider chasm between conservatism and progressivism. I present the political ideas of the Israeli left as future-oriented and ingrained in progressive premises of idealpolitik and multiculturalism. From these premises, the Zionist left, which does exist, advocates for a two-state solution, while the non-Zionist egalitarian left seeks the removal of the Jewish identity from the state so that all people in Israel-Palestine in a one state could be completely equal. But of course, the right wing in Israel completely rejects those progressive premises from the first place. The Israeli right starts from the ultimate conservative disposition, that of protecting the status quo, while holding on to historical particularism, Western cultural superiority over the Arab-Muslim world, and power politics. Out of these premises, the political conclusion of the Israeli right, which would clearly look absurd to most international observers, is that Israel can remain Jewish, it can remain substantially democratic, and spread from the river to the sea. Which brings me to the second misconception that I challenge in my book. As you can imagine, this type of Israeli right-wing ideas has been referred to in the literature as populist, ethnic nationalist, nativist, illiberal, etc. In the second chapter, I challenge these theories' ability to comprehend the political agents that they seek to examine. When my research started around 2017, one of the most prominent theories was Cas Mudde's populist radical right in Europe, which was applied on Israel multiple times. However, when I tried to use available conceptual tools on the arguments of right-wing figures, I found myself analyzing between the lines more than the texts themselves, and ended up analyzing my own thoughts about the Israeli right, rather than the actual arguments of right-wing politicians in Israel. So here, similarly to the first chapter, I do not argue that these theories are wrong. What I'm saying is that they are right, but too narrow to provide a sufficient toolkit to explain the ideology of political leaders and their parties. These are thin ideological concepts that lack consistent direct engagement with the arguments of their research subjects. Beyond that, those thin right-wing concepts require a host ideology, which I argue is most oftentimes conservatism. I argue that if we zoom in closely, we would find that prominent right-wing figures frequently manipulate conservative values to advocate for radical ends. To challenge those thin concepts that dominate the literature, I take around 20 pages to develop a theory of contemporary conservatism. I rely both on critics of conservatism and advocates of conservatism and recent comparative work. I analyze the ideational relations between social conservatism, national conservatism, and constitutional conservatism, and show how this ideology can be, in theory, manipulated into a radical anti-democratic tool. Utilizing conservatism this way also shifts the focus to challenges coming from within the democratic system. So if we take, for example, a nativist, populist, radical, illiberal actor, these are usually anti-democratic, inherently anti-democratic, and we a priori condemn them. But if we take, alternatively, a radicalized conservative, they are mainstream right-wing actors that could have been a legitimate actor, but has become an efficient tool against democracy. So, setting the scene with these two big theoretical misconceptions about the Zionist consensus on one hand and the right-wing challenge to democracy on the other, I embark on an investigation into the ideology of the Israeli right. So, ever since John Stuart Mill referred to the UK Conservative Party as the stupid party, there has been this sense of academic dismissal of right-wing ideas as unworthy of in-depth analysis. To this day, even as the Conservative Party family is one of the most successful, it is also one of the least researched with regards to its ideology. So I begin the empirical sections of my book, which are chapters 3 to 6, with an inductive overview of right-wing ideology in Israel. I analyze a representative corpus of more than 250 documents that stem from prominent political figures, from Benjamin Netanyahu to Bezalel Smotrich and their parties. I adhere to the epistemological principle of self-identification, meaning I let the agents explain themselves, which allows me to conduct a clinical reconstruction of their arguments, exposing their premises, which I argue are conservative, and also their sophisticated nature. Let me give you an example. So, in the last decade, the Israeli right has reached a unanimous consensus on the need to unilaterally annex the West Bank. However, since most of the area is already de facto under Israeli control, or Israeli occupation rather, most right-wing voices have emphasized the need to simply maintain the status quo and just reject pressure for territorial compromise or two-state solution. The most sophisticated center-right agents had explicitly utilized the language of conflict management rather than conflict resolution. They had suggested a gradual annexation of the least populated areas first, and they even suggested that Palestinians living in annexed territories would receive full Israeli citizenship. So this reliance on gradual changes that build upon existing political discrepancies, while seemingly acknowledging, at least nominally, Palestinian human rights, cannot be regarded as populist or nativist, but it is rather conservative. Such discourse was used to mainstream the idea of a right-wing one-state solution. So, the sophistication of right-wing ideology does not end with these rhetorical tricks. In the fourth chapter of the book, I go deeper into its underlying narrative, exposing its premises on human nature, politics, and the world. The Israeli right actually goes to great lengths to argue in a variety of topics and disciplines. So this chapter would interest historians, international lawyers, and even linguistic experts. I argue that the purpose of this one-state narrative is to reject every aspect of Palestinian nationalism and delegitimize former bilateral negotiations for a two-state solution. And in that regard, by the way, the Israeli right is kind of the mirror image of anti-Zionism, because both ideological movements reject that there are two peoples with equal rights to self-determination between the river and the sea. An argument analysis of right-wing thought explains many ongoing developments. Let me give you just a couple of examples with regard to the current war. So, right-wing rejectionism of bilateral negotiations actually explains why for years the Israeli government had emboldened Hamas over the PLO, because a radicalized Islamist group fits better with the narrative of the Palestinians as an enemy that cannot be compromised with. Now, the one-state ideology also required a steady increase of resources and attention to the West Bank, which factored in Israel's failure to defend against Hamas's attack on October 7th. And we know that just 2 days before the attack, Israel shifted 2 companies of between 100 and 200 trained commandos from defending a defensive border with Gaza to doing police work in the West Bank. In general, the Israeli government's pursuit of an endless war goes against the supermajority of Israelis, between 60 to 70%, who prefer hostage exchange in exchange of ending the war immediately. However, the government's position is in line with its pre-existing ideology and its aspirations for a unilateral annexation and a reversal of previous territorial concessions. And the last example, we all heard the US president suggesting a population transfer of 80% of Gaza during wartime, particularly mentioning the Egypt and Jordan as possible destinations. This notion that Israel's neighbors would be responsible for the Palestinians is an ongoing theme in the rhetoric of the Israeli right, and is part of a preconceived agenda. And I document how a Likud MP has suggested something similar in 2017, and she has elaborated on her position in 2023 when she became the intelligence minister in response to Hamas's attack. And by the way, when Geert Wilders visited Israel 6 months ago, he particularly met with this Likud minister, because Wilders has long been a proponent of seeing Jordan as the real Palestine. So the one-state ideology actually relates to all stages of the current war. However, for years, the radical trends within Likud were effectively obfuscated by a seemingly pragmatic conservative discourse. Benjamin Netanyahu, for example, has often aligned Israel with the democratic West. He presents himself as a classic liberal, an admirer of Thomas Jefferson and Winston Churchill. This attempt to take cover behind some foundations of liberal democracy, manifests once again a challenge to democracy from within. It is incompatible with illiberal populism, but it is compatible with a mainstream ideology that has become radicalized. Thus, conservatism becomes a sophisticated tool for reversing the democratic developments of the last century. Before I present the comparability of the Israeli case, let me say something brief about the fourth misconception that I mentioned. So whenever discussing Israel, there is this overemphasis on religious figures, arguments, and texts. And as you can see in recent documentaries, such as Louis Toureau's The Settlers, which I actually recommend, these absolutely play a role within the Israeli right. However, they form a misconception with all that pertains Benjamin Netanyahu and his ruling Likud party that actually sets the policies on the ground. Therefore, in the 5th chapter of the book, I go deep into the ideology of Likud's founding fathers. These are Ze'ev Jabotinsky and Menachem Begin, depicted here. I show how their one-state propositions were ingrained in a secular understanding of the conflict that is in line with the contemporary right, but also exemplify another angle of its radicalization. Because these figures were also paramilitary, ultra-nationalists. They also rejected every aspect of Palestinian nationalism, and they were also explicitly Eurocentric and condescending. However, for decades, they have also proposed and detailed constitutional mechanisms by which Palestinians were supposed to be equal citizens of a Jewish state. And they had also collaborated with the liberal factions of Zionism, eventually establishing the conservative Likud party. But shifting to Benjamin Netanyahu, I spent around 20 pages thoroughly analyzing his ideology, from his books and speeches to analyzing 30 years of his policies, eventually presenting him as a classic example of a radicalized conservative figure. Which brings me to the 5th and final misconception about the ability to compare Israel to other countries. So get a hold of this. Last month, Benjamin Netanyahu traveled to Hungary for the warm embrace, personal embrace, of Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. Hungary had just pulled out of the ICC to remove any doubt about whether it would turn Netanyahu in to perhaps share a cell with Rodrigo Duterte. In their official statements, both leaders spoke about an alliance of two great histories that share similar values, with both leaders situating these values within our Judeo-Christian civilization, with Netanyahu adding that this is Western civilization as we know it. Now look, it's quite easy for me to come here, score some points with an academic crowd against these right-wing leaders, but I think it's actually more important to emphasize once again that the leading object of protection are history, religious culture, and civilizational lineage. These are conservative aspirations that are being used to challenge international rule of law by two leaders of decaying democracies. So to compare Israel to Hungary or any other country, we do need to analytically separate Israel from the occupied territories of Palestine. Most comparative reviews and experts have done that, and when they've done that, they have classified Israel as a flawed liberal democracy that has been experiencing 1.5 decades of democratic decay, which is quite similar to what we see in Hungary, for example. Because during this period, the Likud governments had legislated against civil society, they have shaped the media to favor the government's stance, they have introduced constitutional amendments to limit minority rights and individual rights, and they have introduced more constitutional amendments to curtail judicial independence. In the 6th chapter, I describe those actions in detail, but I particularly developed the sections on the media because they also directly relate to Benjamin Netanyahu's personal corruption charges. However, my primary contribution is to show how the processes of decay are linked to conservative premises and the one-state ideology in the language of the most prominent right-wing figures, which eventually manifests as a triangle of concepts in the name of my book. So, as for the use of conservative justifications for the processes of decay, they are actually quite comparable beyond the Israeli case. So, for example, in Israel, arguments about history and tradition and protecting judicial restraint and challenging judicial activism were used to turn the judicial branch into a partisan rubber stamp. Arguments about fighting left-wing radicals and protecting national sovereignty were used as pretext to limit democratic participation and deliberation. In a separate study that I published last year, I found some identical arguments in the Hungarian constitution, and we colloquially hear similar justifications in various decaying democracies from India to the United States. Now, as for the one-state ideology, it serves at least two functions in Israel's democratic decay. The first is a reactionary line of thinking in which conservative values are used or manipulated to advocate for returning to a previous, less democratic, obviously, status quo. We can elaborate on that in the Q&A if you want. The second is more straightforward. Since the one-state ideology requires anti-democratic behavior towards non-citizens and would effectively entrench a second-class status for Palestinians, the Israeli right had to dismantle democratic institutions that would hinder that. Now, obviously, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the horrors that we have been seeing and hearing for the last 20 months are incomparable to anything that we see in Europe, of course. But issues that involve protecting the historical privileges of dominant groups in society are readily available everywhere. In the US and in EU countries, the immediate suspect is, of course, immigration policies. But it can also involve the status of Christianity, preserving gender privileges, colonial traditions, the monarchy, or even benign cultural aspects like preserving national symbols or an official language. Protecting traditions that conservatives believe are valuable for social stability is not inherently anti-democratic. However, that their protection might lead conservative parties to radicalize against the democratic system especially when it is perceived as benefiting progressive ideologies that undermine those traditions. And in Israel, radicalized conservatives have also become the promoters of an endless war. I conclude. The triangle of radicalized conservatism, one-state ideology, and democratic decay is dominating Israel and Palestine, and is a major factor in the Middle East as well. In the final chapter of my book, I analyze what will happen if things won't change. Basically what I say is that if the Israeli right would not magically moderate and the Israeli opposition would remain fragmented and marginalized, no worst-case scenario should be left off the table. And things can actually get much worse than they are right now. You know, when people ask me what is a political scientist, I often reach out for a metaphor. Sometimes I say tongue-in-cheek that we're like the bin people trying to sort out and upcycle all the trash that we hear in the news. Sometimes I say that we're like entrepreneurs trying to find investors in our startup of good governance. But more and more often, I see our line of work as equated to a cancer research project. Because we deal with humankind's worst diseases. War, poverty, corruption, sometimes all of the above. But just like researchers of a chronic critical disease, we refuse to see them as fatal. We wake up every morning and continue to investigate, even if we know that we might not find a cure tomorrow, even if we might not find a cure at all. We trust the scientific method and the scientific community to come together to refine a diagnosis that step by step would bring us closer to a remedy. I have tried to put forth a diagnosis in this book. My diagnosis is that the Israeli right is the dominant force in Israel today. Historically, it has been an attempt to combine liberal and traditional values. This conservative balance failed. And conservative arguments became an efficient tool to mainstream radically anti-democratic one-state policies. These policies would likely include the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, endanger Middle East peace treaties, and will systematically dismantle all democratic institutions within Israel. While there might be some short-term relief, my prognosis for Israel and Palestine is quite pessimistic. However, I hope my research is clear-eyed enough for us to speak about realistic treatments to radicalized conservatism. As societies get polarized about national identities and majority-minority relations, radicalized conservatism in Israel sends the most glaring warning sign that I hope will provoke some good faith discussion about ideology and democracy. And with that, I conclude. I thank you for listening, and I welcome your questions.